So if you wanted to calculate the number of possible paths you could take from point A to point C, then what we need to do is find the number of paths you can take from point A to point B, and then multiply that by the number of paths you can take from point B to point C. And we can just count here. We can see that there are 4 paths from A to B, so 4, and 2 paths from B to C, so 2. And then we can multiply 4 by 2, so 4 times 2 is equal to 8. And 8 is the number of paths that you can take from A to C. And how this works is that, so for example, if you take this first path at the top from A to B, this one, you have 2 possible paths you can take from B to C once you get to B. So that's 2. And then for each of the other paths from A to B, that's the same. So it's 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 because there's 4 paths from A to B, or 2 times 4, and that is what we've written here. 4 times 2 equals 8 total paths. And if you have something like this, where you want to count the possible paths from A to D, but you have something where it splits off into 2 in the middle, like here you can either go from A to B or A to C and still end up at D. You might think that you want to multiply by 2 first because you can go to either B or C, that's 2 possible routes, but that's not actually how we should do it. Since there are 2 possible routes, we should figure out how to get from B to the end and C to the end and then add them together, as you can go to either of them from A. So what we can see is that B to D, there are 3 possible paths, so we mark this as 3, and from C to D, there are 2 possible paths, we mark this as 2. And these are the only possible paths, so we can do 3 plus 2, not multiplied by 2, equals 5 paths. And that is our answer. And you can count for yourself. 5 paths is the right answer, and the reason we don't multiply by 2 when we're considering from A to B or A to C is because we only multiply if multiple paths lead to the same place. For example, here, B to D, there are 3 paths, and if it kept going, we need to multiply again if there are multiple paths from like D to E or something like that. Now let's get into some examples. So for this problem, if you wanted to calculate the number of paths we could take from P to S, first we need to calculate the number of paths we could take from P to Q, Q to R, and then R to S. So we can just count for each one. P to Q, there are 3 paths. Q to R, there are 3 paths, and R to S, there are 2 paths. And this is pretty simple. We just need to multiply all of them together. So 3 times 3 times 2, which is equal to 18 paths. And 18 is the number of paths we can take from P to S. Now let's do another example. If we wanted to calculate the number of paths we could take from A to B, we would need to consider the top and the bottom. And again, we don't multiply by 2 at the very beginning just because A can go both ways. The top and the bottom have their own separate possibilities, and you can go either way. So let's calculate the number of paths you could take from the top first. And for this one, we don't have any letters for all of the points, but we can still do it pretty easily. So let's see here, from this point to this point, there are 2 paths. And from that point to the next point, there are 2 paths. Or from this point to B, there's only 1 path. So we don't really need to write anything for that. And for the bottom, there's 3 paths for the first 2 points. And then from the next point to the next point is 3 paths. So 3 times 3 and 2 times 2 is equal to 9 and 4 respectively. And again, we don't multiply 9 and 4, instead we add them because the top and bottom are their own separate paths. So 9 plus 4 is equal to 13 paths, and 13 is our answer from A to B. Now let's get into some practice problems. If you think you know how to do this one, then pause the video and try it. But this one asks, how many paths are there from A to D? And as you can see, from each point to the next point, there's only 1 possible way to go. So this means we just need to calculate all of the possible ways you can go from one point to the next, and then multiply all of them together. So let's start with A to the next point, and there are 4 paths you can take just by counting. And that point to the next point, there are 2 possible ways. And that point to D, there are 3 possible ways. And those are all the numbers we need. So let's just multiply all of them together. So 4 times 2 times 3 and then we get 24 as our answer. So there are 24 total paths we can take from A to D. Now let's do another practice problem. If you think you know how to do this one, then pause the video and do it. But this problem asks how many paths are there from A to B? And as we can see in this problem, there are two separate parts, paths from A to B. You can go either the top way or the bottom way, and each one has a number of paths in them. So let's focus on the top first, and then we can calculate the bottom, and then we can add them together. So we can go from A, and there's two possible paths to the next point. So 2, and then 3 from that point to the next, and then just 1 from that one to B. So the top is 2 times 3 times 1, which is just equal to 6. And now let's do the bottom. So A to the first point, there are 3 possible ways, and that point to the next, there's 2, and the next to the next, there's 2, and the next to the B, there's 2. So it's 3 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 24. And then we add both these together, so 6 and 24 added together is 30. So this means there are 30 possible paths from A to B. Now, let's do one last practice problem. If you think you know how to do this one, then pause the video and try it. But this one asks how many paths are there from A to E? And this one might seem a little intimidating at first because there's a lot of points and a lot of places you can go from the different points. But let's focus on A first. How many points can it go from A? It can go to either B or D. So what we can do is separate this into 2, like we always do, 1 for going to B and 1 for going to D. Now let's focus on the part where you can go from A to B. So from A to B there are 3 possible paths, so let's just write that now. And from B to E is kind of complicated because you can either go directly to E or just go from C and then to E. So what we can do is calculate the number of paths you can go that touches C, and then calculate the number of paths that doesn't touch C, and then add them together. There's only one path that doesn't touch C, and it goes directly to E, so that's 1. And then from B to C to E, there's 2 from B to C, and then 1 from C to E. So that's 2 times 1, so it's 2, plus 1, that's 3. So the total number of paths from B to E is 3. So we multiply 3 by 3 is equal to 9. So there are 9 possible paths in the first, the top number of paths from A to B, I guess. Now let's focus on going to D from A. This one's pretty simple. There's 2 from A to D, then 2 from D to E. And as we learned, we just multiply these together, so 2 times 2 is equal to 4. And then we add 9 plus 4, and we get 13 total paths from A to E. And it wasn't as hard as it seemed because we can just separate this whole thing into 2 parts, one from going from A to B and then one going from A to D. So everything that I explained in this video and all the problems that I went through should teach you everything that you need to know about counting paths. If you learned something from this video, or if you enjoyed it, then please consider liking and subscribing.